For more than 4 decades, Ricky Gervais has built a reputation for saying exactly what everyone else is afraid to say. He's mocked celebrities, challenged institutions, and turned controversy into an art form. But in early 2026, something happened that no one expected. The loudest voice in comedy suddenly went silent. There were no jokes, no sarcastic interviews, no provocative posts, only 2 simple words typed in response to a fan. Those 2 words revealed more about the man behind the public persona than years of award show monologues ever had. Because behind the fame, behind the fearless comedian, and behind everything the world believes it knows about Ricky Gervais, there has always been one woman. A woman he met when he was just 20 years old and never let go of. Then, in early 2026, she received news that brought both of their worlds to a standstill. This is the story of Ricky Gervais and Jane Fallon, the only love of his life. Ricky Dean Gervais was born on June 25, 1961, the youngest of 4 children growing up on a council estate in Reading, Berkshire. His father was a Canadian laborer, while his mother, Eva, worked tirelessly to hold the family together. She had very clear ideas about what she wanted for her youngest son. Hoping he would become a scientist, she once gave him a large biology book as a gift. Ricky accepted it, glanced through its pages for a moment, and confidently announced that he intended to become a pop star instead. Without missing a beat, his mother replied that pop star was simply another word for a junkie, a response delivered with the perfect timing of someone who had heard enough unrealistic dreams in her lifetime. In 1980, Ricky enrolled at University College London to study biology. That decision lasted exactly 2 weeks before he switched his major to philosophy. The year before starting university, he had worked as a gardener at the University of Reading. Not because he had a carefully planned career path, but simply because he needed something to do while trying to figure out what that path might be. While studying at UCL, Ricky finally got his chance to chase his musical ambitions. Alongside a friend, he formed a synth-pop duo called Siona Dancing, believing wholeheartedly that this was the opportunity that would launch his career. They signed with London Records and released their debut single, More to Lose. It reached only number 117 on the charts. Their follow-up single, Bitter Heart, performed slightly better, climbing to number 79. Those modest chart positions were enough for the record label to conclude that the experiment was over. Within a year, the band was finished. Looking back years later, Ricky described the experience with the dry humor that would eventually make him famous, saying his rock career had lasted exactly 1 year. Just 1 year. Music wasn't finished with him quite yet. After Siona Dancing ended, Ricky became the manager of a young band called Suede, a group that would later become one of Britain's most celebrated acts of the 1990s. He helped guide them during their earliest days before eventually telling the band he could no longer manage them. Reflecting on it later, he observed, without any hint of bitterness, that Suede's career truly took off only after he left. As always, his timing seemed almost comically unfortunate. Then came what Ricky often refers to as the years of The Office. Not the television series that would later make him famous, but the ordinary reality of office life. It was the familiar routine of fluorescent lighting, endless meetings, and 9-to-5 administrative work. By his late 20s, he was employed in the management office of a London entertainment company, handling paperwork, filing documents, and dealing with the everyday logistics of an industry that still hadn't given him a chance to be creative. He turned 30, then 32. There was little reason to believe anything significant was about to change. What almost nobody knew, and what Ricky has quietly revealed in interviews that many people never saw, was that Jane Fallon was the reason he never gave up. She was the person who kept insisting that he was genuinely funny. Not in the polite way people encourage someone to be kind, but with the certainty of someone who had watched him for years and knew exactly what he was capable of. Jane had known Ricky since he was 20 years old. She witnessed every failed dream, every disappointment, and every setback. Yet she never once suggested that he abandon his ambitions for something safer or more sensible. The two first met in 1982 during their final year at University College London. Jane was studying history while Ricky was studying philosophy, and unsuccessfully trying to become a pop star. Over the years, they have described the circumstances of their first meeting in slightly different ways, suggesting it was one of those moments that only becomes significant in hindsight. What is certain is that by the time they graduated, they were already together. 2 years later, in 1984, they moved into their first home together, a tiny single-room flat in King's Cross. It wasn't the polished and fashionable King's Cross people know today. In 1984, the neighborhood had a far rougher reputation, the kind of place where things happened after dark that most people preferred not to look too closely at. Their room sat above what Ricky has described as a rather seedy sauna. They owned little more than a bed, a refrigerator, and each other. The room was so small that Ricky could reach the fridge without even getting out of bed. Rather than remembering those years with embarrassment, he has always spoken about them with genuine affection, recalling them as a time when they had almost nothing materially. But somehow, it was enough. While Ricky continued searching for the career he hadn't yet discovered, Jane quietly built one of her own. She established herself in television first as a script editor and later as a producer, working on productions including EastEnders, This Life, the influential mid-1990s drama that defined a generation of British viewers and teachers. Over the course of 2 decades, she earned her reputation through her own talent and professional judgment. She wasn't simply Ricky Gervais's girlfriend. She was Jane Fallon, a respected producer in her own right. Meanwhile, Ricky was still circling the opportunity that would eventually change everything. In the late 1990s, he landed a behind-the-scenes job at the alternative London radio station XFM. Almost immediately, as he has admitted himself, he realized he had absolutely no idea what he was doing. So he did what he had always done whenever life placed him somewhere unfamiliar. He taught himself. Ricky Gervais eventually created a radio show that stood apart from anything else on British radio at the time. It was relaxed, honest, and filled with unexpected tangents, driven by observations so genuine that listeners felt as though they were overhearing a real conversation rather than consuming something carefully produced. It was also the first place where the version of Ricky Gervais that the world would later come to know emerged clearly. At the same station, Stephen Merchant was working in production. The two began talking, exchanging ideas, and improvising together. They became fascinated by the comedy hidden within office life, the suffocating, oddly funny tragedy of a man convinced he was charismatic and deeply loved, while every possible perspective revealed the opposite. Neither of them could let go of that idea. In 1998, they recorded what they called a pre-pilot test tape. At its center was David Brent, a middle manager working for a paper company in Slough whose endless need for approval was obvious to everyone except himself. Ricky Gervais played the character with remarkable precision and complete commitment, giving the impression that he had spent his entire life observing this exact type of person. In truth, he had. He had encountered versions of David Brent in every office where he had worked, every band meeting he had attended, and every management position he had ever held. David Brent was never simply invented. He was carefully assembled from years of observation. The BBC eventually commissioned The Office, and the series premiered in 2001. When the audience research results arrived after its premiere, they were deeply disappointing. By most accounts, the show had received the lowest audience scores the BBC had seen for a new program in years. The only recent program that had performed even worse was Women's Lawn Bowls. As a result, people within the BBC began questioning whether commissioning the series had been a mistake. Ricky Gervais, however, did not panic. He later explained the reason in interviews with a level of clarity that sounded simple, but was actually uncommon. At 40 years old, he had not spent the previous 2 decades desperately trying to become a television star. Instead, he had spent those years working in offices, failing at various ambitions, and watching Jane build a successful and serious career while he struggled to discover his own path. Because of that, when the BBC informed him that the ratings were poor, he simply accepted the news, responding in essence, "All right. See you then." He did not carry the particular fear that comes from believing everything depends on one opportunity succeeding. That freedom from fear allowed The Office to remain exactly what it needed to be, without anyone softening its edges or reshaping it into something safer and more comfortable. Gradually, the show found its audience, and eventually it found them completely. By 2004, when The Office won the Golden Globe for Best Television Series, it had already been sold to 59 countries. It was also being adapted in the United States, where the American version would run for 9 seasons on NBC and become, arguably, the most successful sitcom in the history of American television. At 42 years old, Ricky Gervais stood on the Golden Globe stage accepting an award for the very show that had originally received lower audience scores than Lawn Bowls. Jane was there in the room, just as she had been present for every major milestone in his life. Not merely as someone accompanying him, but as the person he genuinely spoke with before and after those important moments. Ricky has repeatedly said in interviews that Jane is smarter than he is and even funnier than him in private conversations. Whenever he is trying to judge whether an idea is truly good, she is the person whose opinion he trusts above anyone else's. As he once explained, he believes he has a good instinct for these things, but he always checks with Jane because she tells him the truth directly. She always has. Following the success of The Office, Ricky Gervais entered a decade in which he was free to create exactly what he wanted. Through a combination of fortunate timing, determination, and the independence that came from owning his own work, he reached a position where very few people could dictate his creative choices. From the beginning, he had insisted on co-writing, co-directing, and co-producing The Office. BBC executives were surprised that someone creating his first television series demanded such extensive creative control. Ricky simply told them that if they wanted him, those were the conditions. The reason he could make such demands, and refused to negotiate them away merely to get the show produced, was that he genuinely did not mind if they rejected the project altogether. As he later explained, he knew he wanted to own his own labor, and that became the greatest lesson he learned. He went on to create Extras, a series that was both funnier and sadder than anything he had previously produced. Later came Derek, in which he portrayed a character whose uncomplicated kindness surprised many viewers who knew him only from his sharp Golden Globe persona. He also created Afterlife, a Netflix series centered on a widowed journalist who decides to behave as unpleasantly as possible because he feels he has nothing left to lose. The series became one of Netflix's most watched British productions. During filming, Ricky often cried on the very first take of almost every emotional scene. Throughout his career, he has maintained that comedy is fundamentally rooted in empathy, believing that people laugh because they instinctively understand what the right thing should be. Ricky Gervais also hosted the Golden Globe Awards 5 separate times. On each occasion, he stood before Hollywood's most famous and influential figures and openly said the things many of them preferred not to hear in public. During his 5th appearance as host in 2020, he remarked that Apple had produced a television show about dignity while being associated with a company that operated sweatshops in China. He also told the audience that if they won an award, they should simply come on stage, thank everyone, and leave because nobody cared about their political opinions. He delivered these remarks calmly, smiling throughout, without giving the slightest indication that he intended to apologize afterward. He never did. Ricky has often said that pursuing popularity is never the right goal in art. If popularity comes naturally, that is wonderful, but deliberately chasing it usually leads artists in the wrong direction. During those same years, Jane quietly stepped away from television altogether and established herself as a novelist. Jane Fallon's first novel, Getting Rid of Matthew, published in 2006, quickly became a bestseller, and every novel that followed enjoyed similar success. Over the years, she has written more than 10 novels, each known for being sharp, witty, and emotionally perceptive, earning a loyal readership entirely on her own terms. In 2020, University College London honored her with an honorary fellowship, a meaningful recognition from the very university where she had first met Ricky Gervais. It was also an acknowledgement that she had established herself as a significant figure in her own right. Despite spending decades together, Jane Fallon and Ricky Gervais never married. Whenever the subject came up in interviews, both of them consistently gave the same explanation. Jane once told the Daily Mail that they had never felt strongly about getting married. She explained that if either of them had truly cared about having a wedding, they probably would have done it, but it had simply never been something either of them genuinely needed. Ricky expressed the same sentiment in his own words, saying that they were married in every way except for the ceremony. They shared everything, owned everything jointly, and had lived together for more than 30 years. As he once asked, how were they not married except in the eyes of God? Just as they chose not to marry, they also mutually decided not to have children. It was never a painful decision or a source of conflict, but rather something they both arrived at naturally and discussed without drama. Although interviewers had asked about it repeatedly for nearly 4 decades, their answer never changed. Instead, they built a different kind of family. They devoted themselves to their cats with the genuine affection of people who found in animals a simple, uncomplicated source of everyday love. Alongside their pets, They had each other, their work, and the quiet rhythm of a life they consciously chose together every single day for more than 40 years. What is rarely discussed, however, is the personal cost of being Ricky Gervais during the years when the internet increasingly viewed him as a controversial figure. His comedy about religion and celebrity generated prolonged public criticism, and he even received death threats. Although he occasionally acknowledged those threats in interviews, he deliberately avoided giving them more attention than he believed they deserved. Jane Fallon has never publicly described what those difficult years felt like inside their home, but she experienced them alongside him. She remained by his side throughout it all. Ricky has often said that Jane is the person he comes home to after everything else. No matter what happened in public, the house remained peaceful. The cats were there, Jane was there, and that quiet home became the center around which everything else revolved. On one occasion, Ricky remarked that he could have owned a huge house, but he would rather have been comfortable, creative, and had Jane. He said it simply, without trying to make it sound poetic, which is often how he expresses the things he genuinely means. Then, in March 2026, Jane Fallon shared a selfie on Instagram that immediately caught people's attention. Wearing a black t-shirt printed with the words "Bit of News" at the top and "No One Panic" at the bottom, she revealed that she had been diagnosed with breast cancer a month earlier. Fortunately, it had been detected at a very early stage, and her prognosis was excellent. She explained that shortly before Christmas, she had attended a routine mammogram despite having no symptoms or any indication that something was wrong. During the examination, a radiographer noticed something suspicious and referred her for additional testing. What followed were further mammograms, biopsies, and eventually an MRI to identify the affected area precisely. She admitted that it had been a lot to deal with and frankly acknowledged that the experience had been overwhelming. Surgery had already been scheduled for 2 weeks later, and she said she simply wanted to get it over with. Although she emphasized that she was receiving outstanding medical care and that everything would be fine, she also admitted that, for the time being, she had little energy for anything beyond listening to audiobooks and working on jigsaw puzzles. Alongside the selfie, Jane posted 2 additional photographs. One showed a stuffed bear named Dr. Eric wearing a toy stethoscope, while the other featured her beloved cat Pickle, whom she had humorously illustrated wearing a handmade purple nurse's uniform. She joked that Dr. Eric was on duty while Nurse Pickle was wondering when lunch would arrive. It perfectly reflected Jane Fallon's characteristic way of facing frightening situations. With humor, honesty, the comforting familiarity of small everyday things, and a firm refusal to make her own fears someone else's burden. Her request for readers not to panic was not only reassurance directed at them, but also a reflection of her own approach. She openly admitted that she was frightened, while simultaneously expressing confidence that she would recover. Somewhere between those two truths, she found the time to draw a tiny nurse's uniform on her cat. Around the same time, Ricky Gervais unexpectedly fell silent on social media. For someone who normally posted almost every day, the absence was immediately noticeable. There were no jokes, no controversial observations, and no commentary on whatever public debate happened to dominate that week. Eventually, one fan politely asked how Jane was doing. Ricky replied with only 2 words, "Doing well, thank you." After that brief response, he returned to silence. The man who had spent decades telling the world that he did not care what anyone thought of him, the man who had never seemed concerned with public opinion, chose to say only those 2 words because the rest of the story belonged to Jane and Jane alone. He understood that instinctively and respected it completely. Ricky has often spoken about what comedy truly is. He once explained that the funniest person most people know is not a professional comedian, but rather a father, grandfather, or uncle. Humor, he argued, comes from recognizing familiar human moments, like watching someone walk into a pub, noticing their expression, and immediately understanding what they are thinking. Real comedy, in his view, is built on empathy. People laugh because they instinctively recognize what is right, what is awkward, or what is deeply human. Ricky built his entire career around that belief. Yet the person who first encouraged him to trust his own sense of humor, who believed in him before anyone else did, who watched him fail in music, management, and office work, while continually telling him to keep going because his real talent was worth waiting for, was always Jane Fallon. Their story began in 1982, when they met as students at a university in London. They had little money, no clear plan for the future, and very modest circumstances. They moved into a tiny room above a rundown sauna, because it was all they could afford. Ricky never left, and neither did Jane. More than 4 decades later, after worldwide fame, public controversy, death threats, and years spent fighting to maintain ownership of his own creative work, perhaps the truest thing about Ricky Gervais remains remarkably simple. Before he found success, fame, or recognition, he found the right person. Once he found her, he never let go. If this story has moved you, if you have ever loved someone quietly and faithfully for many years without feeling the need to turn that love into a public performance, leave a comment below. We read every one. And perhaps the question worth reflecting on is this. Is it possible that the greatest thing a person can do is simply choose the same person every morning for 44 years, without ceremony, without paperwork, and without needing anyone else to witness it?